Then, it was time for African affluence, keeping pace with Africa's growing middle class. This was the first debate of the day.
At this point, how big do we estimate the middle class actually is across the region?
I wrote the first report that really triggered the debate back in 2011 on the size and the middle class in Africa, the dynamics of it. It's like this: out of 1 billion people, you have 300 million, a third, living on $0 to $2 a day on a purchasing power parity basis. And then from $2 to $4 a day, you have another 300 million people. And then above $4 a day to about $20 or upwards is another third, another 200 million. Your core middle class is actually 150 million people spread across 54 countries. So what you get is companies saying, oh, where is this middle class? It's everywhere. And most of these middle class individuals are living in cities. So urbanization is a big driver of the middle class in Africa.
Michael, I want to ask you about the experience in KwaZulu-Natal. Has there been, KwaZulu-Natal obviously does not, it doesn't include one of the sort of major cities of South Africa, so Cape Town, Johannesburg. Have you seen a growth in the middle class within your state that's sort of equivalent to what Michael is describing on sort of the more macro level?
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for the opportunity, but let me start by correcting you. We in KwaZulu-Natal have got the biggest city in terms of contribution, which is Durban. Durban is bigger than Cape Town in terms of its contribution, and KwaZulu-Natal contribute more than 16.5% to the gross domestic output, and Cape Town only contribute 13.4%. So we're higher in terms of contribution. Okay. But let me come back to the issue you're raising. Well, the first thing, my starting point before I come to your question, I think in debating Africa and Africa's future prosperity, we have to put the matters into context. There is always an assumption of regarding Africa as one country when it is 54 countries. And therefore it is important because in any given moment when we are debating the fortunes of the United Kingdom, you have to contextualize it within the EU. You can't come and debate what happens in the EU and then say it actually cut across and is same to each and every country within the EU. So it's important. And I'm raising that point because I'm hoping down the line we'll have an opportunity to actually debate some of the issues raised by Professor Paul earlier on, because some of them I really don't think I fully concur with them. I disagree with some of those views. However, in KwaZulu-Natal, I think South Africa somewhat is lucky. And I present that we are lucky in the sense that we are the second biggest economy in the continent. But if you look at our economy, we're the most highly diversified economy. We don't rely normally on your commodity resources entirely, and therefore we're highly, highly diversified. We've got the best of the infrastructure, and all of these other things that make our economy, whilst a third world country, but we've got the paradox that we've got the features in urban centers of a highly developed economy, but then in your peri-urban areas and your countryside, which are the rural areas, you would, of course, be able to find, we call it the second economy, the features of a second economy. In KwaZulu-Natal, what has happened very recently is that there was a study that was done about the people who are millionaires in the country. And for some reason, Durban has got the highest number of the new emerging millionaires.
Last year, there was an executive from Nestle who sort of famously or infamously said, you know, we overestimated the size of the middle class in Africa. We're actually having to scale back our operations. It's actually very small and it's not growing. You're in the asset management business. What are your thoughts on that assessment?
I think it's a question of what are you trying to sell them? From what we see in the companies that we invest in, I think there's always a big disconnect between the reality on the ground and the official data a lot of the time. When people talk about the proportion of the African continent that lives on $0 to $2 a day or from above $10 a day, I think a lot of the official data underestimates the size of wealth that you have on the African continent. In 2000, we were meant to bid for the mobile phone license. We did advisory work for the bidding of mobile phone licenses in Nigeria. And based on the per capita numbers and everything we knew about the Nigerian economy at that time, our projections were that the most you could sell would be 20 million mobile phones. And the valuation of the licenses was based around that. Of course, the reality was today there are close to about 75 or 80 million mobile phones in Nigeria. They have one of the highest per capita spend on mobile telephony. And when Nigeria finally got around to recalculating its GDP, GDP expanded significantly. So when you talk about the wealth or the income, the official numbers don't always tie up with the reality of consumer behavior. For instance, let's take a simple comparison. The UK, you would say average per capita GDP in the UK is about $40,000. And on average, a UK citizen would spend around $300 a year on telephones. We would then go to Africa and we say, well, the average per capita GDP is $1,500, and the average African spends roughly about $75 on the telephone. If his income was only $1,500, he can't afford to spend that, such a big proportion of it on mobile telephony.
The way that a lot of investors have tried to go about sort of tapping the middle class has been to build shopping malls. There are shopping malls popping up everywhere in Algeria and Morocco and Kenya, where have you. Do you think that this is an effective mechanism for sort of channeling the new class of middle class consumers, towards businesses and towards sort of expanding enterprises?
And as Mthuli has said, the middle class is still maybe about 30% of the African population. We're talking of about 300 million people. But in terms of the middle class, who now have the purchasing power, who now have that means, and in terms of their growth prospects, to move from that 30 to about 42%, if I'm right, I think I read part of your work, in the next 30 years, it's a huge prospect. And how do you accommodate those people? You must provide the infrastructural development to accommodate that purchasing power, and thereby things like your malls, things like your roads and development. Without it, how would there be taxes? How would there be growth in some certain parameters of the economy?
The question is there a distinction to be drawn between a middle class and a consumer class, especially in the context of sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, naturally, the middle class plays many roles, other than just consuming things and being a source of entrepreneurship. That's one. The other is just political involvement. I think it's fair to say that the growth of the opposition in Africa in the last 20 years has been through the kind of urban areas, I can be very specific about where the DA supporters live, Mabuyakhulu, or the MDC supporters in Zimbabwe, or the MMD supporters under, Chiluba. And it's quite clear that they are urban-based. There's a clearly middle-class tinge to it. So whether they stand for the right things or not, the middle-class parties are driven by that middle class and the urban base. So there's a sense in which they then garnish the political landscape in the right way, by the way. So clearly they have a political role, without question.
When you look at the growth of 3% that we just launched last week at the World Bank, related to raising borrowing costs, agricultural prices are going down at the same time as commodity price. All this together will affect the growth of the middle class. I'm not worried about the middle class as they are right now. The growth of the middle class in the next 5 to 10 years will be affected. In some country, it will be stuck because the growth will not be anymore in their size. So I think we have to be extremely careful what we're defining. If you look at the housing market, if the housing market is affected because of the growth of the commodity of the middle class, this will have a whole impact on the job creation. So I think we need to think about it in that term and not only talk about it right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any responses there?
Well, my argument is, that's why I actually premised this, that we must be building diversified economies in Africa. We really are not going to be focusing on whether one sector or commodities or agriculture, we must be highly diversified so that we can become competitive into the future. If we don't do that and we lack to do that, then of course we will actually be putting us into a very difficult situation. And I think that's a point. And I think we do also welcome the fact, and I agree with you that when it comes to how China has actually related to the continent, and you go to some parts of Africa and some countries in Africa, you will see visible signs of the Chinese investment. And therefore, there has been almost like this very dominant and committed, and if you look where the China's investment were in year 2000 and where they were in 2014 in the African continent, it has shown an exponential growth.
Professor Collier talked about the need for urbanisation, and the panel has also talked about land ownership and property ownership. In terms of the growth of the middle class and asset ownership in terms of land and property, if you look at the cost of building affordable housing, even at the very lowest level, people at the income levels you talked about don't have that money, even something sub of $15,000 to buy into the property. The interest rates borrowing from the local banks are far higher than are affordable, again, for the same. So a mortgage, typically, as we would understand it, isn't affordable. So what role is there for government in providing that finance so that properties can be built and developed, and financing for the individuals who own the properties?
I think for government, should it actually be their role? The role is to provide the enabling infrastructure for such investments to happen. Now, if you look at the increase in urbanization, whereby we believe in the next few years, 50% of Africans will be living in urban cities, but how would they live on air? So how are we going to cater for those 50% of people who would probably generate 80% of the GDP just by staying in those urban regions? I think it's a mix of both private investment and government investment.